The moldy sandwich landed on Marcus Reynolds's first-class tray with deliberate contempt, as Claire Wilson's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. The distinguished CEO watched her performance with measured calm, his finger discreetly activating the airline surveillance system he had commissioned as part owner of Elite Airways. Behind the curtain, Claire's whispered slurs about how these people didn't belong in first class recorded perfectly, each word cementing her fate, while Marcus documented the treatment with patient precision. His calculated silence as he pressed the call button again carried more threat than any confrontation could. Not anger, but quiet resolve that would transform this ordinary flight into the most devastating miscalculation of Claire's career. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. Marcus Reynolds adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket as he settled into Seat 2A of Elite Airways Flight 347 to San Francisco. The supple leather first-class seat embraced him with the familiar comfort he had come to expect from his frequent travels, a small luxury he allowed himself after 20 years of building Reynolds Technologies from the ground up. As other passengers boarded the aircraft, Marcus pulled out his tablet and opened an email containing the quarterly performance reports for Elite Airways, the airline he partially owned through a silent investment partnership he had established 3 years prior. "Good afternoon," a flight attendant greeted the silver-haired gentleman across the aisle, her voice warm and inviting. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Whitman. May I offer you a glass of our signature champagne before takeoff?" Marcus observed the interaction from his peripheral vision while continuing to review the impressive revenue figures on his screen. Elite Airways had experienced a 15% growth in the premium travel segment under his strategic guidance, though few employees knew of his involvement beyond the boardroom. He preferred it that way, experiencing the airline as any other customer would, gathering insights that quarterly reports and customer surveys could never truly capture. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Claire, moved efficiently through the cabin, distributing hot towels and champagne flutes to the passengers in the first few rows. Marcus noticed her warm smile fade slightly as she approached his seat, her eyes flicking momentarily to his dark complexion before settling somewhere just above his shoulder. "Towel?" she asked, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been moments before with the other passengers. "Yes, thank you," Marcus replied with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to such subtle shifts in treatment. He accepted the towel with a polite nod, watching as Claire moved to the passenger seated behind him, her voice immediately brightening as she offered champagne and a warm welcome. Marcus returned his attention to his tablet, swiping to review the customer satisfaction metrics he had personally championed as vital indicators of the airline's performance. The irony wasn't lost on him as he waited for his own pre-departure beverage, the one he had specifically ordered when booking his ticket, just as he always did. 10 minutes passed. The remaining first-class passengers received their drinks, including a middle-aged couple who boarded after Marcus and were now sipping from crystal flutes filled with bubbling champagne. Marcus closed his tablet and pressed the call button, his finger lingering momentarily as he considered whether this small battle was worth fighting. With a silent exhale, he pressed it firmly. Claire returned, her expression tight. "Yes, sir?" "I believe I'm still waiting for my pre-departure beverage," Marcus said, his voice measured and professional. "I pre-ordered the Macallan 18 when I booked my ticket." "Oh," Claire responded, her eyes darting toward the galley. "I'm not seeing that in our system. We're actually running low on premium beverages for this flight. I can offer you orange juice or water if you'd prefer." Marcus glanced past her shoulder, noting the fully stocked bar cart being prepared for service. "That's unusual. I received a confirmation email specifically mentioning my beverage preference." He pulled up the email on his tablet and displayed it to Claire. "Perhaps you could double-check?" "Sir, as I mentioned, we have limited stock today," Claire replied, her tone growing increasingly dismissive. "The system sometimes overbooks certain items." I'll bring you some orange juice." Before Marcus could respond, Claire had already turned away, leaving him watching as she whispered something to another flight attendant who glanced in his direction with a barely concealed smirk. Marcus took a deep breath and returned to his tablet, opening the communication app he used to stay in touch with his executive assistant, Jessica. He typed a brief message. "Experiencing some interesting service discrepancies on Elite Flight 347. Might be nothing, but make a note to discuss with Diane in HR when I return." The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure and thanking passengers for choosing Elite Airways. Marcus returned his seat to the upright position and stowed his tablet, watching as Claire distributed warm mixed nuts to the passengers around him. When she reached his row, she placed a small packet of pretzels on his tray table, the kind typically served in economy class, before continuing her rounds. Marcus examined the sealed package with a clinical detachment that belied the slow burn of realization forming in his gut. This wasn't merely poor service or an oversight. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Marcus reopened his messaging app and sent Jessica another text. "On second thought, please contact Diane immediately. I want to know if there have been any other service complaints filed by minority passengers in first class over the past quarter. And remind me, when did we install the cabin surveillance system in the premium cabins?" The response came quickly. "System went live 3 months ago across the entire fleet. All footage stored for 30 days. Should I be concerned?" Marcus watched as Claire and another flight attendant disappeared behind the galley curtain, their hushed laughter drifting back to the cabin. "Not yet," he typed, "but stay close to your phone. I may need you to make some calls before we land." The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and Marcus felt the familiar pressure against his chest as they ascended into the clouds. What should have been the beginning of a peaceful 6-hour flight was quickly transforming into something else entirely. A test of patience, professionalism, and principles that would have consequences far beyond this journey from New York to San Francisco. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, prompting the cabin crew to begin their service preparations. Marcus Reynolds closed his eyes briefly, recalling the board meeting just 3 years ago when he had proposed a substantial investment in Elite Airways. His fellow board members at Reynolds Technologies had questioned the wisdom of diversifying into air travel, but Marcus had seen an opportunity to transform an industry plagued by declining service standards and increasing customer dissatisfaction. The silent partnership had been strategic, allowing him to observe operations honestly while implementing changes from within the boardroom. Jessica's response illuminated his tablet screen. HR records show 17 formal complaints from minority passengers in first class over the past year, 5 specifically mentioning flight attendant Claire Wilson. 3 were dismissed for insufficient evidence, and 2 resulted in customer vouchers, but no disciplinary action. Surveillance system is fully operational on your aircraft. Diane is standing by for your call. Marcus acknowledged the message with a quick tap, feeling a familiar weight settle across his shoulders. The burden of proof always seemed heavier for some than others. He tucked the tablet into his jacket pocket as Claire approached with the meal cart, her practiced smile reappearing as she served the passenger across the aisle. "Mr. Whitman, we have your special order ready. The seared salmon with truffle risotto and a glass of the Montrachet you requested." "Chef's compliments," she said, carefully arranging the white china plate before the silver-haired gentleman. The aroma of the gourmet meal wafted through the cabin as Claire continued serving each passenger with attentive care. Marcus watched the ritual unfold, noting how she leaned in to explain the wine pairing to a young couple, how she remembered another passenger's preference for extra bread. When she finally reached his seat, Claire's demeanor shifted subtly as she placed a covered plate before him without meeting his eyes. "Your meal," she stated flatly, already turning away. Marcus lifted the dome to find a dry sandwich on visibly stale bread, a small cup of lukewarm apple juice placed beside it. The contrast between his meal and those around him was stark enough to draw curious glances from nearby passengers. "Excuse me," Marcus called, his voice calm but firm enough to halt Claire's retreat. "I believe there's been a mistake with my meal. I pre-ordered the chef's special when I booked this flight." Claire turned back, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any record of that order. We're serving what's available." "That's interesting," Marcus replied, retrieving his phone to display his confirmation email. "Because I have the confirmation right here, along with your system's acknowledgement of my dietary preferences and meal selection." Claire barely glanced at the screen. "As I explained earlier about your beverage, our system sometimes overbooks certain items. There simply isn't enough of the premium meal service to go around today." A passenger seated across the aisle, Whitman, looked up from his salmon, fork suspended mid-air, as he followed the exchange with thinly veiled interest. Marcus noticed but maintained his focus on Claire. "I see plenty of premium meals being served," he observed, gesturing discreetly to the surrounding passengers. "Perhaps you could explain why I'm the only one in first class receiving what appears to be an economy meal?" Claire's smile tightened. "Sir, we have to prioritize certain guests based on status and loyalty program standing. I assure you, this is standard procedure." "I'm a Platinum Elite member," Marcus stated evenly. "I've flown over 200,000 miles with this airline in the past year alone." "I'll check with my supervisor," Claire replied, her tone making it clear she had no intention of doing so. She disappeared behind the galley curtain, leaving Marcus with the unappetizing meal before him. Marcus sat motionless for a moment, considering his options. 20 years of navigating corporate America as a black executive had taught him the value of choosing his battles wisely. This particular battle, he decided, was worth fighting, not just for himself, but for the 17 others who had filed complaints, and likely dozens more who had simply accepted the treatment as an unavoidable reality of their existence. He pressed the call button again, waiting patiently as minutes ticked by without response. Finally, a different flight attendant approached, a younger man whose name tag read Michael. "Can I help you?" Michael asked, his tone suggesting that helping was the last thing he wanted to do. "Yes," Marcus responded, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I'd like to speak with the purser or chief flight attendant about an issue with my meal service." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. "Claire is handling this section. What seems to be the problem?" "I pre-ordered a meal that wasn't delivered, and I've been given what appears to be an economy class option instead," Marcus explained, aware that several passengers were now openly watching the interaction. "When I inquired about it, I was told that certain passengers were being prioritized over others, despite my Platinum Elite status." "Sir, sometimes we have to make service adjustments mid-flight," Michael stated, his voice taking on a patronizing edge. "I'm sure Claire explained this to you. We simply can't accommodate every special request." Marcus nodded slowly, taking note of Michael's badge number as he spoke. "I understand service adjustments. What I don't understand is why everyone around me received the premium meal they ordered while I received this." He lifted the sandwich, which had begun to curl at the edges as it dried out. "Perhaps you could explain the criteria being used for these adjustments?" Michael's posture stiffened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers." Marcus hadn't raised his voice at all, and he was keenly aware that the only disturbance was the one created by the increasingly obvious disparity in service. A quiet tension settled over the first-class cabin as passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some pointedly returning to their meals, while others continued to observe with unmasked curiosity. I haven't raised my voice, Marcus stated calmly. I'm simply asking for an explanation for the discrepancy in service. Behind Michael, Claire reappeared, whispering something to her colleague before both of them retreated to the galley. Through the partially open curtain, Marcus caught a glimpse of them huddled with a third crew member, all three occasionally glancing in his direction. Marcus reached for his phone again, opening his email to find the direct contact information for Diane Chen, the head of HR at Elite Airways. As he composed a message detailing the ongoing situation, he became aware of a presence beside his seat. Looking up, he found the silver-haired Mr. Whitman standing there, holding his half-finished plate of salmon. "Couldn't help but overhear," Whitman said, his voice lowered. "Been flying this route for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's not right." He paused, seemingly weighing his next words carefully. "Want me to say something?" Marcus appreciated the gesture, but shook his head slightly. "Thank you, but I can handle this." He returned his attention to his phone, adding another paragraph to his email as the crew members continued their whispered conversation behind the curtain, unaware of the silent documentation taking place or the storm gathering on the digital horizon. Marcus set his phone down and cautiously examined the sandwich before him. The bread's edges had an unmistakable greenish tint that grew more pronounced as he gently lifted the top slice. Dark spots of mold peppered the underside, confirming what his instincts had already told him. This wasn't merely poor service, but something deliberately malicious. He carefully replaced the bread and pushed the plate away, his appetite thoroughly extinguished by the discovery. "Everything all right with your meal, sir?" It was Michael again, his voice carrying a hint of mockery that wasn't lost on the passengers within earshot. "No, it's not," Marcus replied evenly, gesturing toward the sandwich. "There's visible mold on this bread. I'd like to speak with the captain about this situation." Michael leaned closer, examining the sandwich with exaggerated scrutiny. "I don't see anything unusual. Perhaps you're mistaken." "I assure you I'm not," Marcus stated, maintaining his composure despite the escalating provocation. "This bread is clearly spoiled, and I'd like to know why I was served it when everyone else received fresh, high-quality meals." Claire appeared beside Michael, her face flushed with what appeared to be irritation rather than embarrassment. "Is there a problem here?" "Again?" "Yes, there is," Marcus responded, directing his attention to Claire. "I've been served moldy bread while everyone around me enjoys their premium meals. I've asked repeatedly for an explanation, and so far, all I've received are excuses and dismissals." Claire's eyes narrowed, a flash of something darker than mere annoyance crossing her features. "Sir, if you don't like what we've served, you're welcome not to eat it. But I will not have you disrupting this flight with baseless accusations." "Baseless?" Marcus echoed, his voice remaining measured despite the blatant gaslighting. "The evidence is right here." He gestured toward the sandwich. "I'd like to know why I'm receiving this treatment when I've been nothing but polite in my requests. Maybe because some people don't know how to be grateful for what they're given," Claire muttered, just loud enough for Marcus and several nearby passengers to hear. "Always wanting special treatment." The comment hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. An uncomfortable silence descended over the first-class cabin as passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to hear, while others exchanged knowing glances. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but years of navigating similar situations had taught him that losing composure would only reinforce the stereotypes people like Claire clearly held. "I don't want special treatment," Marcus clarified, his voice firm but still controlled. "I simply want equal treatment. The same meal options, the same service, and the same respect afforded to every other passenger who paid for a first-class ticket." Claire's demeanor shifted, her professional mask slipping further as she leaned closer to Marcus, lowering her voice. "Listen, I don't know how you got into this cabin, but we both know you don't belong here. So why don't you just sit quietly and be thankful you're not back in economy where— Claire! Michael interrupted, suddenly aware that several passengers had angled their phones in their direction. That's enough. Let's discuss this in the galley. As the two flight attendants retreated behind the curtain, Marcus exhaled slowly, processing what had just occurred. The woman's prejudice had finally surfaced explicitly, confirming what her actions had already suggested. Marcus reached for his phone again, this time opening the Elite Airways Executive app, a secure platform accessible only to senior management and major stakeholders. With a few taps, he accessed the live feed from the cabin surveillance system, confirming that cameras were indeed recording. Behind the galley curtain, raised voices carried into the cabin despite attempts to keep the conversation private. I cannot believe these people. Claire's voice emerged clearly in a momentary lull of the aircraft's ambient noise. He probably used points or some diversity program to get up here. Did you see how he was dressed? Acting like he owns the place. Marcus's finger hovered over the messaging icon, considering whether to alert Diane immediately or to let the situation unfold further. The decision was made for him when the galley curtain parted, and a third crew member emerged, the purser, based on her uniform insignia. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her tone professionally neutral, but with an underlying tension. "I understand there's been some confusion with your meal service. I want to assure you that we take all passenger concerns seriously." "Thank you," Marcus responded, noting her strategic use of his name. Clearly, someone had finally checked the passenger manifest. "As I explained to your colleagues, I pre-ordered a meal that wasn't delivered, and instead received food that appears to be spoiled." The purser nodded, her expression carefully composed. "We're investigating the situation. In the meantime, I can offer you a selection from our business class menu, if that would be acceptable." "What I find interesting," Marcus replied, ignoring the downgraded offer, "is that your colleague suggested this treatment was intentional, with rather specific implications about why I might be receiving it." The purser's professional veneer cracked slightly. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Claire is one of our most experienced flight attendants." "Experience doesn't preclude prejudice," Marcus observed quietly, aware that nearby passengers were still following the exchange. In fact, sometimes it merely provides more opportunity to act on it. The intercom crackled to life suddenly, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hoffman speaking. Our flight attendants have informed me of a situation in the first-class cabin. I want to remind all passengers that crew instructions must be followed at all times for safety reasons. Any disruptive behavior will not be tolerated." The message was clear in its implications. Marcus was being framed as the problem. He glanced around the cabin, noting how several passengers were now looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, transforming his reasonable request for equal treatment into a disruption that warranted the captain's intervention. The purser straightened, emboldened by the captain's tacit support. "Mr. Reynolds, I must ask you to accept the situation as it stands. We're doing our best to accommodate everyone." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "What exactly about my behavior has been disruptive? I haven't raised my voice. I haven't made demands beyond asking for the service I paid for. I haven't refused any safety instructions. Sir, your continued questioning of our procedures is creating tension in the cabin," the purser replied, her tone hardening. "I'm going to have to ask you to drop the matter." Marcus registered movement in his peripheral vision. Mr. Whitman had risen from his seat again, approaching with deliberate steps. "Excuse me," the older gentleman interjected, addressing the purser. "I've been observing this situation, and frankly, your treatment of this gentleman has been appalling. He's been nothing but polite, while being served moldy food and spoken to condescendingly. The purser turned to Whitman, her expression softening immediately. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter for the crew to handle." "Is it?" Whitman challenged, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like blatant discrimination. I've been flying with Elite for over 20 years, and I've never witnessed such poor service or disrespect toward a passenger." A murmur of agreement rose from several other passengers, the tide of opinion visibly shifting as people began to connect the dots between Marcus's treatment and the color of his skin. The purser's expression tightened as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. "We'll bring you something from business class right away, Mr. Reynolds," she stated abruptly, turning on her heel to retreat to the galley. "That won't be necessary," Marcus called after her, his voice calm but carrying clearly. "What's necessary is an explanation for why I'm being treated differently from everyone else in this cabin." The purser paused, visibly flustered by the direct challenge to authority. Before she could respond, the galley curtain parted again, and Captain Hoffman himself emerged, his face set in stern lines as he surveyed the first-class cabin. His gaze settled on Marcus with unmistakable hostility. "Sir," the captain began, his voice carrying the weight of ultimate authority on the aircraft, "I understand you're causing a disturbance. I need to inform you that if this behavior continues, I'll be forced to divert the flight for the safety of all passengers." The threat hung in the air as Marcus calmly reached for his tablet, opening his executive email with deliberate movements. "Captain Hoffman, I suggest you reconsider that course of action. I haven't caused any disturbance, as numerous witnesses in this cabin can attest. What I have done is question why I've been singled out for substandard service and disrespectful treatment." The captain's expression darkened. "Sir, as commander of this aircraft, my determination of what constitutes a disturbance is final. I'm giving you one last opportunity to comply with crew instructions and cease this disruptive behavior." "What specific instruction have I failed to comply with?" Marcus asked, his finger poised over the send button on an email addressed to the airline's board of directors, an email that would reach their phones long before the plane could land at any diverted airport. The captain didn't answer immediately, perhaps realizing the shakiness of his position. In the momentary silence, the purser leaned forward to whisper something in his ear. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a hint of uncertainty entering his eyes. "This isn't about complying with instructions," Marcus continued, seizing the moment of hesitation. "This is about being treated with basic dignity and receiving the service that every passenger in this cabin has paid for. The only disruption has been created by your crew's discriminatory actions." A tension headache began to form at Marcus's temples as he maintained eye contact with the captain, neither man willing to back down in what had transformed from a simple service issue into a pivotal moment of principle. Behind them, the cabin had fallen completely silent, the collective attention of every passenger fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. The captain's authoritative presence loomed over Marcus as the standoff continued, every passenger in the cabin now fully engaged in the unfolding drama. Time seemed to slow as Marcus weighed his options, his mind racing through potential outcomes with the strategic precision that had guided his business decisions for decades. He could acquiesce, accept the substandard treatment, swallow his pride, and maintain the peace that everyone around him seemed so desperate to preserve. It was the path of least resistance, one he had taken in his younger years when building his career seemed more important than challenging the subtle indignities he faced daily. The memory of those compromises now left a bitter taste in his mouth, far more unpalatable than the moldy bread he'd been served. Or he could stand his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, diminished, or dehumanized based on the color of their skin. The surveillance cameras were recording. The witnesses were watching. The evidence was mounting. This wasn't merely about a meal anymore. It was about accountability in a system designed to avoid it. "Captain Hoffman," Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a quiet strength that commanded attention, "before you make a decision that will affect everyone on this aircraft, I think there's something you should know." "I've made my decision," the captain interrupted, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. "This is my aircraft, and I will not tolerate any passenger undermining my crew's authority." Marcus nodded slowly, his finger hovering over the send button on his tablet. "That's precisely the problem, Captain. You've made a decision based on false information. You haven't once asked for my perspective on what's happening, yet you're prepared to inconvenience hundreds of passengers by diverting this flight." The captain's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Sir, this is your final warning. Comply with crew instructions immediately, or I will be forced to declare an emergency and land at the nearest available airport." "And what instruction would you like me to comply with?" Marcus asked, maintaining his composed demeanor despite the escalating tension. "So far, I've been told to accept moldy food, to be grateful for discriminatory treatment, and to remain silent when subjected to racial prejudice. Which of these instructions do you believe is reasonable or lawful?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed the captain's face, quickly masked by renewed determination. "This isn't about race. This is about maintaining order in my cabin. It became about race the moment your flight attendant decided I didn't belong in first class," Marcus countered, his gaze unwavering. "It became about race when I was served spoiled food, while everyone around me received their proper meals. It became about race when your crew member made explicit comments about my presence here." Behind the captain, Claire had emerged from the galley, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and anxiety, as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "Captain, perhaps we should—" "Mr. Reynolds is correct. Mr. Murt." Whitman's voice cut through the tension, drawing all eyes to the silver-haired passenger who had risen to stand beside Marcus. "I witnessed the entire interaction, as did several others in this cabin. Your flight attendant made explicitly racist remarks and deliberately served this gentleman spoiled food. If you divert this flight, you'll be doing so solely to punish a passenger for calmly asking to be treated with basic human dignity." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin as other passengers began to voice their support. A woman across the aisle held up her phone. "I've recorded parts of this interaction. The flight attendant clearly said he doesn't belong in first class, despite his platinum status." Captain Hoffman's authority was visibly eroding as the collective witness of the cabin united against the narrative he had been fed. His gaze darted between the passengers, the growing chorus of dissent undermining his position with each passing moment. "Captain," Marcus said, his tone deliberate, "I'm giving you an opportunity to handle this situation professionally. You can either address the discriminatory behavior of your crew, or you can compound the problem by diverting this flight without cause. A decision that will have consequences far beyond today." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. The captain's jaw worked silently as he processed his increasingly limited options. Behind him, Claire disappeared back behind the galley curtain, the sound of urgent whispers carrying faintly into the cabin. Marcus maintained his steady gaze on the captain, allowing the weight of the moment to settle between them. The confrontation had reached its tipping point. Retreating now would only embolden the behavior he had witnessed, not just on this flight, but throughout the airline he partially owned. The responsibility to act weighed heavily on his shoulders, a burden he had carried throughout his career as he navigated spaces never designed with people like him in mind. With deliberate calmness, Marcus pressed send on the email he had composed to the board of directors. an email detailing the discriminatory treatment he had experienced and requesting an immediate review of the aircraft's surveillance footage. The quiet chime of confirmation seemed to echo in the tense silence of the cabin. "I've just communicated with the airline's executive team," Marcus stated, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed cabin. "I've requested that they review the surveillance footage from this flight, which I believe will provide conclusive evidence of the treatment I've received. I have also asked them to prepare for the possibility that you might divert this flight without legitimate cause." The captain's expression darkened at the direct challenge to his authority. "Surveillance footage? There are no cameras in this cabin." "Actually, Captain Hoffman, there are," Marcus corrected him, his tone matter-of-fact. "The premium cabin surveillance system was installed 3 months ago across the entire fleet. Every interaction in this cabin for the past hour has been recorded and stored on the airline's secure servers, including the conversations that took place behind that curtain." The color drained from Captain Hoffman's face as the implication registered. Behind the galley curtain, Marcus could hear Claire's voice rising in panic, though her words were indistinct. The captain's hand moved to his communication device, but he hesitated, suddenly uncertain of his next move. "Captain," Marcus continued, seizing the moment of uncertainty, "I understand that you're in a difficult position. You've been given incomplete information by your crew, and you're trying to maintain order on your aircraft. But the facts of this situation are not in dispute. They've been witnessed by multiple passengers and recorded by the cabin surveillance system. The question now is how you choose to proceed." The intercom crackled suddenly, and a flight attendant's voice announced from the cockpit, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our originally planned route. The captain will be returning to the flight deck momentarily to assess the situation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." The announcement was clearly a pretext, a transparent attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. Captain Hoffman's expression had transformed from authoritative confidence to barely concealed concern as he realized the potential consequences of his actions. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the cockpit, leaving the first-class cabin in a buzz of whispered conversations and speculative glances. The purser approached Marcus cautiously, her demeanor markedly different from minutes earlier. "Mr. Reynolds, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding. We'll have a proper meal brought to you immediately from business class." "This isn't about the meal anymore," Marcus replied evenly. "This is about addressing a pattern of discriminatory behavior that appears to be tolerated within this airline." The purser's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine anxiety beneath. "Sir, I assure you that Elite Airways has strict policies against any form of discrimination. This was an isolated incident." "Was it?" Marcus interrupted, his voice level but firm. "Because according to the airline's own records, there have been 17 formal complaints from minority passengers in first class over the past year alone, 5 specifically mentioning flight attendant Claire Wilson. 3 were dismissed for insufficient evidence, and 2 resulted in customer vouchers, but no disciplinary action. That doesn't sound isolated to me. That sounds systematic." The purser's eyes widened at the specific information, details that only someone with access to the airline's internal HR records would know. She retreated a step, suddenly uncertain of exactly who she was dealing with. Behind the galley curtain, Marcus could hear Claire's voice rising in distress. How would he know about cameras? Nobody told us there were cameras. What else does he know? The intercom crackled to life once more, Captain Hoffman's voice now strained with forced professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. After consulting with air traffic control, we've determined that a slight deviation from our flight path is necessary. We'll be landing at Denver International Airport in approximately 50 minutes to address a technical concern." We apologize for any inconvenience and expect to resume our journey to San Francisco after a brief stop. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Marcus exhaled slowly, recognizing the decision for what it was, an attempt to remove him from the aircraft without explicitly calling him the problem. The captain was choosing escalation over accountability, punishment over resolution. As the announcement concluded, Marcus opened his messaging app once more, typing a brief but decisive message to Jessica. Denver landing confirmed. Full intervention needed. Contact Diane immediately. I want her team waiting at the gate. Full surveillance review. Captain Hoffman is diverting to remove me from the flight. The response was instantaneous. Already on it. Diane deploying to Denver now. Board has been notified. Stand by for further updates. Around him, passengers began to murmur in frustration at the unexpected delay. A businessman checked his watch with visible annoyance, while a young couple whispered anxiously about connecting flights. The ripple effects of the discrimination Marcus had experienced were now spreading throughout the aircraft, affecting every passenger's journey, a microcosm of how unchecked prejudice inevitably damages the whole, not just its intended target. As the aircraft began its descent toward Denver, Marcus sat back in his seat, his expression calm despite the storm raging around and within him. The confrontation had escalated beyond anything he had anticipated when he first questioned the substandard meal, but perhaps this was always where such moments were destined to lead, to crossroads where one either acquiesced to injustice or stood firmly against it, regardless of the consequences. Here's Block 4, tension builds, for First-Class Justice. First-Class Justice, Block 4. Tension builds. The atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense as the aircraft began its descent toward Denver. Passengers throughout first class whispered among themselves, casting glances at Marcus, while the flight attendants avoided eye contact altogether, moving through their landing preparations with mechanical efficiency. Marcus remained composed, reviewing the chain of events that had led to this unexpected diversion, each moment crystallizing in his memory as evidence for what would undoubtedly become a watershed moment for elite airways. His tablet chimed softly with an incoming message from Jessica. Diane has confirmed surveillance system is active and recording. Legal team downloading footage now. HR representatives and airport officials will be waiting at Gate B-17 in Denver. CEO has been notified and is monitoring the situation personally. Marcus acknowledged the update with a slight nod, as if to himself. The machinery of corporate accountability was now in motion, systems he had helped put in place during his 3 years of silent partnership with the airline. He had always believed that true change required both ideal principles and practical mechanisms to enforce them. Today, those mechanisms would be tested. Captain Hoffman's voice crackled over the intercom again, the strain in his tone barely masked by professional detachment. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. We'll be on the ground in approximately 15 minutes. Through the partially open galley curtain, Marcus could see Claire and Michael huddled in urgent conversation, their faces tight with concern. Claire's gestures grew increasingly agitated as Michael checked his phone, his expression darkening with each passing moment. Marcus couldn't hear their words over the aircraft's descent noise, but their body language conveyed mounting anxiety. A soft chime from his tablet drew Marcus's attention to another message from Jessica. Surveillance audio recovered from galley. Sending transcript now. The attached file opened automatically, revealing a conversation that had taken place behind the curtain shortly after his interaction with the captain. Claire, I can't believe this is happening. Who does he think he is? Michael. I told you we should have just given him the regular meal. Claire. Why? So he can come up here and act like he owns the place? These people need to learn their place. Michael. Lower your voice. You know we're not supposed to. Claire. What? Say what we're all thinking? First, they take over coach. Now they're pushing into first class. Next thing you know, they'll be flying the planes. Captain Hoffman. What's the situation here? Claire. Captain, that passenger in 2A is being disruptive. He's making the other passengers uncomfortable. Captain Hoffman. How exactly? Claire. He's complaining about the food, making accusations. Several passengers have expressed concern. Michael. He's been pretty confrontational. Captain Hoffman. Has he threatened anyone? Violated any safety protocols? Claire. Not exactly, but his attitude is disruptive. He's one of those people who's always looking for special treatment, always playing the race card. Captain Hoffman. I see. Well, we can't have disruptions in the cabin. I'll have a word with him. Claire. Maybe we should just divert, get him off the plane. Put him on the no-fly list so he doesn't cause problems for other crews. Captain Hoffman. Let me handle this. If he doesn't cooperate, that's exactly what we'll do. Marcus closed the transcript, a mixture of vindication and weariness washing over him. The naked prejudice in the conversation confirmed what he had already known, but seeing it documented so explicitly still struck him with the force of an unexpected blow. This wasn't just poor service or a misunderstanding. It was deliberate discrimination coordinated among multiple crew members, including the captain himself. Across the aisle, Mr. Whitman leaned slightly toward Marcus. I couldn't help noticing you seem remarkably calm for someone being diverted to Denver, he observed quietly. Almost as if you expected this. Marcus met the older man's gaze with a measured smile. Let's just say I've learned to prepare for various contingencies in my line of work. Whitman nodded thoughtfully. Investment banking? Technology and strategic consulting, Marcus replied. Reynolds Technologies. Recognition dawned in Whitman's eyes. You're Marcus Reynolds, he said, realization tempering his voice. Your company implemented the digital transformation for half the Fortune 500. Among other projects, Marcus acknowledged modestly. Whitman's expression shifted to something between amusement and admiration. Something tells me Captain Hoffman has made a significant tactical error today. Before Marcus could respond, the aircraft touched down on the Denver runway with a firm jolt, the thrust reversers roaring as they decelerated rapidly. The usual post-landing announcements followed, but with a notable deviation from standard protocol. Rather than thanking passengers for choosing elite airways, Captain Hoffman tersely instructed them to remain seated until further notice, citing security procedures that needed to be followed. Marcus's phone vibrated with an incoming call, a direct line he reserved for his most senior executives and critical situations. Jessica's voice came through clearly as he answered. Marcus, are you all right? I'm fine, he assured her, speaking quietly but without concern for being overheard. What's the situation on the ground? Diane and the team are at the gate. Airport security has been briefed that this is an internal airline matter, not a security threat. They've agreed to stand down and let our people handle it. The surveillance footage has been reviewed by legal. It's conclusive. And the board? Fully informed. The chairman called an emergency session for tomorrow morning, but he's already authorized you to take whatever actions you deem necessary in the interim. His exact words were, clean house if you have to. Marcus nodded to himself, the weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. What had begun as a personal affront had escalated into a moment that would define the culture of an entire organization, one that carried his silent investment and, by extension, his tacit endorsement of its practices. The implications extended far beyond this flight, this crew, or even this airline. It represented a crossroads in how corporations addressed the persistent reality of discrimination in spaces presumed to be beyond its reach. The aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate, but the usual bustle of deplaning did not begin. Instead, the cabin remained eerily quiet as passengers awaited further instructions, the tension palpable in the recycled air. Captain Hoffman emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp, but his expression taut as he made his way down the aisle toward Marcus. "Mr. Reynolds," the captain began, his tone carefully neutral, "I need to ask you to deplane first. There are representatives waiting to speak with you at the gate." Marcus met the captain's gaze steadily. "I'm aware of that, Captain Hoffman, but before I leave this aircraft, I'd like to understand precisely why we've been diverted. For the record." The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "As I announced, we're addressing a technical concern." "And what technical concern would that be?" Marcus pressed, his voice calm but unyielding. "Something that developed suddenly after I questioned your crew's discriminatory behavior?" Captain Hoffman glanced around at the attentive passengers, clearly uncomfortable with the public challenge to his authority. "Sir, this is not the appropriate forum for this discussion. If you have concerns about your treatment, customer service representatives will be happy to address them at the gate." "I think this is precisely the appropriate forum," Marcus countered, gesturing to the cabin around them. "These passengers have had their travel plans disrupted. They deserve to know why. Was there actually a technical issue with this aircraft, Captain Hoffman? Or was this diversion your attempt to remove a passenger who dared to question being served moldy food and subjected to racial slurs?" The question hung in the air, direct and uncompromising. Several passengers leaned forward in their seats, equally interested in the captain's response. The moment stretched as Hoffman visibly calculated his options, none of them appealing. "I made the decision based on the information available to me at the time," he finally stated, his words carefully chosen to admit nothing while conceding nothing. "And what information was that, specifically?" Marcus continued, undeterred by the evasion. "That a first-class passenger calmly requested equal treatment? Or was it the information shared by your flight attendant that I didn't belong in this cabin because of the color of my skin?" A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers reacted to the explicit naming of what many had already perceived. Captain Hoffman's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own actions exposed to public scrutiny. "This conversation is over," he declared abruptly. "Security will escort you from the aircraft." As if on cue, the cabin door opened, but rather than the airport security Hoffman had clearly expected, a woman in a tailored suit stepped aboard, flanked by two men in Elite Airways executive uniforms. Marcus recognized Diane Chen immediately, the head of HR, moving purposefully down the aisle toward them. "Captain Hoffman," she began, her voice professional but cooling several degrees as she addressed him, "there will be no need for security. Mr. Reynolds is not being removed from this flight." Confusion washed over the captain's face. "Ma'am, I've made the determination that—" "Your determination has been overruled," Diane interrupted crisply, turning to acknowledge Marcus with a respectful nod. "Mr. Reynolds, on behalf of Elite Airways, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for what you've experienced today. The behavior exhibited by certain crew members is completely unacceptable and contrary to our core values." The captain's expression cycled rapidly through disbelief, anger, and dawning comprehension as he processed the implications of Diane's presence and her deferential treatment of the passenger he had been attempting to remove. "Ms. Chen, with all due respect, I am the commander of this aircraft, and—" "Not anymore, Captain," one of the executive officers interjected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You and your crew are being removed from duty pending a full investigation. A replacement crew is already boarding through the rear entrance. They will complete this flight to San Francisco once this matter is resolved." The captain's face paled, as the full gravity of the situation finally registered. His gaze shifted to Marcus, reassessing the passenger he had dismissed so easily, struggling to reconcile his presence with the corporate response now unfolding. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus met his gaze evenly, years of navigating subtle and overt discrimination having prepared him for this moment of reckoning. "Someone who believed your airline could do better," he replied simply. "Someone who still does." The first-class cabin had fallen completely silent, passengers frozen in their seats as they witnessed the dramatic reversal of fortune playing out before them. Captain Hoffman stood rigid, his authority stripped away in full view of the entire cabin, while Claire and Michael hovered uncertainly at the edge of the galley, their expressions cycling between defiance and dismay as Diane Chen continued addressing the situation with clinical efficiency. "Ms. Wilson, Mr. Barton," Diane called to the flight attendants, her tone firm but controlled. "Please gather your personal belongings and prepare to deplane immediately. Your credentials have been temporarily suspended pending a full investigation into today's events." Claire stepped forward, indignation overriding her shock. "This is ridiculous. We haven't done anything wrong. That passenger was being difficult and making unreasonable demands. The captain made the call to divert for everyone's safety." Diane's expression remained impassive as she held up her tablet, displaying what was clearly surveillance footage from the cabin. "Ms. Wilson, we have complete audio and video documentation of every interaction that occurred on this flight, including your conversations behind the galley curtain. I suggest you comply with this directive without further incident, which would only compound your current situation." The color drained from Claire's face as comprehension dawned. Her gaze darted to Marcus, then to the ceiling panels where the discreet cameras were hidden, their presence suddenly unmistakable now that she knew to look for them. "You can't. This is an invasion of privacy. We weren't informed about surveillance." Page 17 of your employment contract and page 4 of the Flight Attendant Handbook both clearly state that all premium cabins are subject to monitoring for quality control and security purposes, Diane replied without hesitation. "This policy was implemented 3 months ago, and all crew members were notified through multiple channels, including the mandatory training sessions you signed off on completing." Marcus observed the exchange with outward calm that belied the complex emotions churning beneath the surface. There was no satisfaction in watching these individuals face consequences, only a weary recognition that accountability was a necessary part of progress. The surveillance system he had advocated for had been designed primarily to enhance security and improve service quality. Its role in documenting discrimination had been a contingency he had hoped would never be necessary. Captain Hoffman turned to Marcus, his professional demeanor cracking under the strain of public humiliation. "You planned this, didn't you? Came onto my aircraft looking for trouble, baiting my crew into making a mistake." "Captain Hoffman," Marcus replied evenly, "I boarded this flight with the same expectation as every other passenger, to receive the service I paid for and to be treated with basic dignity. The only thing I planned was a business trip to San Francisco. Everything that followed was the result of choices made by you and your crew." The captain's jaw worked silently, searching for a retort that wouldn't further incriminate him. Finding none, he turned abruptly and strode toward the exit, his rigid posture a last attempt at preserving what little dignity remained. Claire and Michael followed reluctantly, casting venomous glances at Marcus as they passed. As the disgraced crew members disappeared through the jetway, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the cabin. The tension that had built over the past hour began to dissipate, replaced by a buzz of whispered conversations as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Several reached for their phones, undoubtedly composing social media posts that would spread the story far beyond this aircraft. Diane approached Marcus, lowering her voice to maintain some semblance of privacy in the crowded cabin. "Mr. Reynolds, I can't begin to express how deeply sorry we are for what happened today. This is a complete failure on multiple levels, and I assure you it will be addressed thoroughly." Marcus nodded, appreciating her professionalism while recognizing that this moment called for more than standard corporate damage control. "Thank you, Diane. I know this isn't representative of the company's values, at least not the values we aspire to, but clearly there are systemic issues that need to be addressed." "Absolutely," she agreed, her expression grave. "The replacement crew will be aboard momentarily, and they'll complete the flight to San Francisco. In the meantime, is there anything we can do to make this right for you?" Marcus considered the question, looking around at the passengers who were still watching the exchange with rapt attention. Some appeared sympathetic, others uncomfortable, and a few seemed openly resentful of the delay. In that moment, Marcus made a decision that transcended his personal experience, one that acknowledged the collective impact of discrimination, even when directed at an individual. "Yes, there is," he replied, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I'd like to address all the passengers once the new crew is settled. This disruption has affected everyone on this flight, and they deserve an explanation." Diane nodded, understanding the implications of his request. "Of course. The replacement captain and crew should be here within 10 minutes. I'll arrange for you to use the intercom system." As Diane stepped away to coordinate with the ground staff, Marcus's phone vibrated with another message from Jessica. "Board chairman wants to speak with you urgently." Media already picking up chatter about an Elite Airways flight diversion involving discrimination. "How do you want to handle this?" Marcus typed a quick response. "Tell the chairman I'll call once we're airborne again. As for media, no comment until I've addressed the passengers and we've gathered all the facts. Have legal prepare a statement emphasizing our commitment to addressing the incident transparently and comprehensively. This isn't just about damage control, it's an opportunity for meaningful change." He'd barely sent the message when another notification appeared, a news alert mentioning Elite Airways, and an unscheduled landing following allegations of discriminatory treatment. The digital age meant that even events unfolding at 30,000 feet couldn't remain isolated for long. By the time they reached San Francisco, this incident would likely be making headlines across the country. Mr. Whitman leaned across the aisle again, his expression thoughtful. "Quite a turn of events," he observed quietly. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years and never imagined I'd witness something like this. Part owner, I'm guessing?" Marcus smiled slightly, appreciating the older man's perceptiveness. "Silent partner. I prefer to experience the airline as a regular passenger. It provides insights you can't get from quarterly reports and customer satisfaction surveys." Whitman nodded appreciatively. "Smart approach, though I imagine today's insights weren't what you had in mind." "No," Marcus agreed, his expression sobering. "But perhaps they were necessary. Some problems remain invisible until they're experienced firsthand." Their conversation was interrupted as the cabin door reopened and the replacement crew boarded the aircraft. The new captain, a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and an air of seasoned professionalism, moved directly to the intercom system. Her voice filled the cabin moments later, clear and authoritative without the defensive edge that had characterized Captain Hoffman's communications. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sarah Lindstrom. I understand today's flight has experienced some unexpected challenges. My crew and I will be taking over from this point forward, and we expect to have you on your way to San Francisco within 20 minutes. We appreciate your patience and understanding during this transition." The announcement was met with scattered applause from passengers relieved that their journey would soon resume. Captain Lindstrom made her way through the first-class cabin, stopping briefly at Marcus's seat to introduce herself properly. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her handshake firm and direct, "I want to personally assure you that my crew and I are committed to providing excellent service to all our passengers without exception. I understand you'll be addressing the cabin before we depart?" Marcus nodded, appreciating her straightforward approach. "Yes, with your permission. I believe the passengers deserve to understand why their travel plans were disrupted today." "I agree completely," she responded. "Just let me know when you're ready." As Captain Lindstrom continued to the cockpit, Diane returned to Marcus's side with a clipboard containing several documents. "These are the preliminary incident reports based on the surveillance footage and witness statements we've already gathered," she explained. "We'll conduct more thorough interviews once we reach San Francisco, but I wanted you to see the initial documentation." Marcus reviewed the reports carefully, noting the clinical precision with which they detailed the discriminatory comments and actions. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous, stripped of the emotional context that had made the experience so dehumanizing. On paper, reduced to timestamps and transcribed dialogue, the incident seemed almost mundane, a routine case of prejudice documented with corporate efficiency. But Marcus knew better. He had felt the weight of those dismissive glances, experienced the humiliation of being served spoiled food, while others dined on gourmet meals, endured the accusations of disruption when he had merely asked to be treated with basic dignity. These were the realities that reports could never fully capture, the lived experiences that policies alone could never address. As the replacement crew completed their preparations and passengers settled back into their seats, Marcus stood and made his way to the front of the cabin where Diane waited with the intercom handset. The moment had arrived to transform an individual injustice into a catalyst for collective change, to address not just what had happened on this flight, but what happened every day in boardrooms, restaurants, shops, and public spaces across the country. He accepted the handset from Diane, taking a deep breath as he prepared to address the passengers whose journeys had become unexpectedly intertwined with his own. The cabin fell silent in anticipation, all eyes focused on the man whose quiet dignity in the face of discrimination had brought them to this unprecedented moment. Here's Block 6, the landing and revelation, for First-Class Justice. First-Class Justice, Block 6, the landing and revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin intercom, "my name is Marcus Reynolds. I want to take a moment to address what happened today and why your journey was interrupted." The cabin remained absolutely silent as passengers from both cabins listened attentively, united by curiosity about the drama that had unfolded and resulted in an unscheduled landing. Some of you witnessed the interactions in first class that led to this diversion. What began as a simple request for the meal I had pre-ordered escalated into something much more serious when I was deliberately served spoiled food and subjected to discriminatory treatment based on my race. Marcus paused, noting the mixture of reactions across the cabin, nods of confirmation from those who had witnessed the events firsthand, expressions of shock from those in economy who were hearing the details for the first time. When I questioned this treatment, the crew responded by characterizing me as disruptive and aggressive, ultimately convincing Captain Hoffman to divert the aircraft to Denver, not because of any legitimate safety concern, but in an attempt to remove me from the flight. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the cabin as passengers processed this revelation. Marcus continued, his tone remaining measured and dignified. "What the crew didn't know is that I am not just a passenger, but also a part owner of Elite Airways. 3 years ago, I made a substantial investment in this airline with the belief that we could build a company that truly values every customer, regardless of their appearance or background. As part of that commitment, I implemented a cabin surveillance system in all premium cabins to monitor service quality and ensure the highest standards for all passengers. The revelation landed with palpable impact, passengers exchanging glances of surprise and understanding as the pieces fell into place. In economy, several passengers had risen from their seats to better hear his words, while flight attendants stood motionless in the aisles, absorbing the implications of his statement. That surveillance system captured everything that happened today, from the initial discriminatory service to the explicit comments made behind the galley curtain to the captain's decision to declare an emergency landing based on false information. The footage has already been reviewed by our HR and legal departments, resulting in the immediate removal of the crew responsible. Marcus shifted his focus, his expression softening as he addressed the collective impact of the incident. I understand that all of you have been inconvenienced by this diversion. Your time is valuable, and this delay has disrupted your plans and schedules. For that, I am truly sorry. He took a breath, knowing that what he said next would transform the mood of the entire aircraft. To acknowledge this inconvenience and demonstrate our commitment to addressing this incident properly, Elite Airways will be providing a full refund of today's ticket price to every passenger on this flight, along with $10,000 in compensation and 5 years of complimentary Elite status upgrades. A stunned silence fell over the cabin, quickly giving way to exclamations of surprise and scattered applause that grew into a sustained ovation. In economy, passengers who had been frustratedly checking connecting flight schedules moments before now stared forward in disbelief, the substantial compensation far exceeding anything they might have expected from a flight delay. This compensation isn't just about today's inconvenience, Marcus continued as the applause subsided. It's a recognition that discrimination affects everyone, even those who aren't its direct targets. When we allow injustice to pass unchallenged in our presence, we become part of the environment that enables it. He handed the intercom back to Diane, who stepped forward to provide the practical details of how the compensation would be processed. As she spoke, Marcus returned to his seat, suddenly aware of the emotional toll the confrontation had taken. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the heated exchanges was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a familiar weariness, the cost of standing ground that should never have needed defending in the first place. Passengers from both cabins began approaching his seat, forming a line that stretched down the aisle. Some simply wanted to shake his hand, others to share their own experiences with discrimination, and many to express admiration for how he had handled the situation. A young black woman from economy leaned in to whisper, "Thank you for not letting it slide. Most of us can't afford to fight back like that." Her words struck Marcus deeply, highlighting the privilege that had allowed him to challenge his treatment where others might have been forced to endure in silence. His position and resources had given him leverage that many lacked, a reality that reinforced his responsibility to use that advantage for systemic change rather than merely personal vindication. As the last passengers returned to their seats and the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Mr. Whitman settled back beside Marcus, his expression thoughtful. "Quite a statement you made there, with both words and actions." Marcus nodded, glancing out the window as the Denver landscape began to recede beneath them. It seemed appropriate. Some lessons need to be expensive to be remembered. $10,000 per passenger is more than expensive, Whitman observed. That's a corporate statement, if I ever saw one. The money isn't the point, Marcus replied quietly. What matters is that everyone on this aircraft now has a stake in this story, not just as witnesses, but as participants. They'll remember this flight not because of the discrimination they saw, but because of the accountability that followed. Whitman considered this, nodding slowly. You're playing a longer game than just addressing one incident. I have to, Marcus said, watching the clouds envelop the aircraft as they climbed toward cruising altitude. Because this was never just about one flight, one crew, or one airline. It's about challenging the assumption that certain spaces aren't meant for people who look like me, and the casual cruelty that enforces those boundaries. As the aircraft leveled off and the cabin service resumed, now delivered with impeccable professionalism by the replacement crew, Marcus opened his tablet to begin drafting the presentation he would deliver to the board the following morning. The surveillance footage provided irrefutable evidence of individual misconduct, but his task now was to illuminate the broader patterns that had enabled such behavior to flourish unchecked. His phone vibrated with an incoming call from the board chairman, Robert Chen. Marcus answered, prepared for the difficult conversation ahead. "Marcus," Chen began without preamble, "I've just reviewed the preliminary reports and footage. It's disturbing, to say the least." "That's putting it mildly," Marcus replied, keeping his voice low despite the ambient noise of the cabin. "The financial impact of your compensation offer will be substantial. The board will have questions." Marcus had anticipated this concern. The financial cost of allowing this culture to persist would be far greater in the long run. Lost customers, lawsuits, reputation damage. Consider this an investment in the company's future, not an expense. There was a brief silence on the line as Chen processed this perspective. "You've never been one to make impulsive decisions, so I trust your judgment here. But what happens next? This incident will be headline news by morning. That's precisely why our response needs to be equally newsworthy," Marcus explained. "I'm preparing a comprehensive proposal for systemic reforms throughout the airline. New training protocols, accountability mechanisms, and revised hiring practices. I'll present it to the board tomorrow morning." "Some members will resist," Chen warned. "They'll argue this was an isolated incident, not a systemic issue." "Then I'll show them the data," Marcus countered firmly. 17 formal complaints from minority passengers in first class over the past year, most dismissed without proper investigation. That's not isolated. That's a pattern. Chen sighed, the sound of someone recognizing the magnitude of the challenge ahead. "You have my support, Marcus. This isn't just the right thing to do morally, it's the right business decision. I'll see you at the emergency board meeting tomorrow." As Marcus ended the call, he noticed several passengers around him openly checking their banking apps, exclamations of surprise confirming that the promised compensation was already being processed. Diane had worked quickly, ensuring that the corporate response matched the urgency of the situation. It was a promising start, but merely the first step in a much longer journey. The remainder of the flight proceeded without incident, the replacement crew demonstrating the standard of service that Marcus had always envisioned for elite airways: professional, attentive, and, most importantly, consistent for every passenger regardless of appearance. As they began their descent into San Francisco, Marcus finalized his notes for the board presentation, knowing that tomorrow would be a defining moment not just for his role in the company, but for the company's future itself. Here's a tighter version of Block 7, with more dialogue for First Class Justice. First Class Justice, Block 7. The aftermath begins. The Elite Airways response team awaited Marcus as he deplaned in San Francisco, the gravity of the situation evident in their expressions. James Peterson, the chief operating officer, stepped forward immediately. "Marcus, I've reviewed the footage. It's inexcusable," James said, extending his hand. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied firmly. "And now we need to ensure it never happens again." The chairman's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow at 8. This story's already breaking across every platform. Inside the executive terminal, analysts had assembled a command center displaying data from customer feedback systems. A young data scientist pointed to a screen showing customer satisfaction metrics. "We've identified a clear statistical disparity in satisfaction scores between white passengers and passengers of color in premium cabins," she explained, highlighting several graphs. particularly on routes staffed by certain crew rotations. And how many of these discrepancies triggered investigations? Marcus asked. Diane stepped forward. Very few. Our systems classified complaints as isolated incidents unless multiple reports targeted the same employee within a narrow time frame. Or perhaps, Marcus said pointedly, it was designed precisely not to identify those patterns. James winced. The surveillance system you implemented has revealed discrepancies we simply couldn't see before. Couldn't? Or wouldn't? Marcus challenged. Systems reflect priorities, James, and our priority now needs to be accountability, not damage control. Which is why I've already initiated a comprehensive audit of all discrimination complaints received over the past 5 years, Diane interjected, including those dismissed at intake. A notification appeared on the main screen showing statements from Claire and Captain Hoffman claiming misunderstanding and suggesting Marcus had leveraged his position for retribution. The lead counsel approached, tablet in hand. The compensation package is making headlines, $10 million total. The board will have questions. They can question the cost of addressing this incident, Marcus replied, or they can consider the much higher cost of ignoring it. Marcus stepped away to call Jessica in New York. The footage has been completely backed up, right? He asked. Triple secured, Jessica confirmed. Copies with our servers, the legal team, and your private cloud. It can't disappear. Good, because tomorrow is when the real work begins. Today was about addressing an incident. Tomorrow is about changing a system. Robert Chen's message appeared on Marcus's phone. Media requests pouring in. They want statements, interviews. How do you want to handle? No interviews yet, Marcus replied, after consideration. Issue a statement acknowledging the incident, confirming immediate action was taken, and announcing comprehensive reforms to be presented tomorrow. Keep the focus on systemic change, not personal drama. A middle-aged black executive approached Marcus, lowering her voice. I've been with this airline 20 years. What happened to you has happened to countless others who couldn't fight back. Thank you for using your position to force this conversation. This isn't just my fight, Marcus responded, meeting her gaze. And the changes we make can't just be about protecting executives in first class. She nodded. The board won't make this easy. Some will try to minimize it, contain the damage, rather than address the cause. Then we'll need to make the evidence impossible to ignore, Marcus said. Tomorrow isn't just about one flight or one crew. It's about acknowledging a reality that's been hidden in plain sight for far too long. As the response team continued their preparations, Marcus surveyed the command center with its screens displaying social media reactions, news coverage, and internal data. The incident had forced a long-overdue reckoning, but the fact that it had required such dramatic circumstances to prompt action was itself an indictment of how deeply entrenched the problems were. James, Marcus called across the room, I want to see complete service records for every crew member who received discrimination complaints in the past 5 years. And I want to know exactly how those complaints were handled, who reviewed them, and what actions were taken. That's hundreds of files, James protested. Then we better get started, Marcus replied without hesitation. Because tomorrow, the board gets every single one. The Elite Airways boardroom fell silent as Marcus concluded his presentation. The evidence of systemic discrimination laid bare before the assembled executives. The surveillance footage from the flight played one final time on the main screen. Claire's contemptuous expression, Captain Hoffman's baseless accusations, and the explicit racial comments captured behind the galley curtain. Gentlemen, ladies, Marcus said, his voice steady as he surveyed the board members' reactions. What we witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, but a manifestation of deeper cultural problems within our organization. The audit has identified 78 similar complaints that were dismissed without proper investigation over the past 3 years. Charles Whitfield, a senior board member with 30 years in the industry, leaned forward with a skeptical expression. While I agree the behavior was inexcusable, isn't the $10 million compensation package excessive? We're talking about poor service, not physical harm. It wasn't just poor service, Marcus countered firmly. It was deliberate discrimination that culminated in an unnecessary flight diversion affecting every passenger. The compensation acknowledges both the inconvenience and our commitment to meaningful change. And this comprehensive reform package you're proposing? Victoria Hayes, another board member, gestured toward the thick binders distributed before the meeting. The implementation costs alone would run into millions. Consider the alternative, Marcus replied. Class action lawsuits, government investigations, sustained reputational damage. Our passengers have smartphones, Victoria. The next incident won't just reach our boardroom, it will go viral globally within hours. Robert Chen nodded in agreement. Marcus is right. We have a choice between leading this change proactively or being forced into it reactively under far less favorable circumstances. The debate continued for nearly 3 hours, with some board members resistant to acknowledging the systemic nature of the problem, while others pushed for even more aggressive reforms. Throughout, Marcus remained resolute, returning consistently to the evidence rather than allowing the discussion to drift into hypotheticals or defensive posturing. This isn't about assigning blame, he emphasized as the conversation approached its conclusion. It's about building accountability into our systems so that every passenger receives the service and respect they deserve, regardless of how they look or where they come from. In the end, the vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. 11-3 in favor of adopting the comprehensive reform package. The dissenters registered their concerns about costs and implementation challenges while ultimately acknowledging that the status quo had become untenable. We'll issue a public statement this afternoon, Robert announced as the meeting adjourned. Full transparency about what happened, the actions we've taken in response, and our commitment to systemic reform moving forward. As the boardroom emptied, Diane approached Marcus with the first implementation timeline already drafted on her tablet. We can begin the enhanced training program next week. The surveillance system expansion will take longer, about 3 months for the full fleet. Good, Marcus nodded. And the review committee for discrimination complaints? I've already identified potential members, diverse in terms of both demographics and positions within the company. We'll need your final approval, of course. Marcus smiled slightly, appreciating her initiative. Share the list with me tonight. I want people who understand what's at stake here, not just for the company, but for every passenger who trusts us with their journey. The Elite Airways first-class cabin gleamed in the morning sunlight as Marcus settled into seat 2A, the same position he had occupied during that fateful flight 6 months earlier. The transformation wasn't just in the recently updated interior, but in the subtle yet significant shifts in service culture that had taken root throughout the airline. Sarah Johnson, now the permanent head flight attendant for the premium New York to San Francisco route, approached with a warm smile that held no trace of the artificial deference that often characterized first-class service. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. Your pre-ordered Macallan 18 and special meal have been noted. Can I get you anything else before takeoff?" "Just the usual hot towel, thank you," Marcus replied, returning her smile as he observed her interactions with other passengers, the consistent professionalism and genuine warmth she extended to each person regardless of appearance or background. As Sarah moved through the cabin, she placed an envelope on Marcus's tray table. "From the crew," she explained before continuing her preparations. Inside, Marcus found a handwritten note signed by every member of the flight staff. "Mr. Reynolds, your courage 6 months ago transformed not just our airline, but our industry. What began as a painful confrontation has become a model for change that airlines across the country are now following. We're proud to serve on an aircraft where every passenger truly receives first-class treatment. Thank you for setting the standard. The crew of Flight 347. Marcus tucked the note into his jacket pocket, his mind briefly turning to the aftermath that had followed for the original flight crew. Claire Wilson, Michael Barton, and Captain Hoffman had not gone quietly. As expected, they had attempted to fight their terminations through their union representatives, claiming they were being scapegoated for what they persistently characterized as a misunderstanding. Their efforts collapsed, however, when the full surveillance footage was shared during the arbitration hearings. The explicit racial comments captured behind the galley curtain, combined with the evidence of deliberately serving spoiled food, left no room for plausible deniability. All three were permanently dismissed from Elite Airways, with the incident documented in their employment records. But the consequences hadn't ended there. The Federal Aviation Administration had launched its own investigation into Captain Hoffman's decision to divert the aircraft without legitimate safety concerns, ultimately suspending his commercial pilot's license for 6 months. More significantly, the incident had been added to airline training programs nationwide as a case study in how bias could compromise flight safety and operational decisions. Claire Wilson had attempted to give interviews portraying herself as a victim of cancel culture, but found little sympathy even among typically receptive media outlets once the surveillance footage became public. The last Marcus had heard, she was working at a regional airline, relegated to short-haul economy routes and subject to enhanced supervision. The most meaningful outcome, though, hadn't been the punitive measures but the structural reforms they had catalyzed. The comprehensive training program implemented across Elite Airways had now been adopted by 3 other major carriers. The Diverse Review Committee for Discrimination Complaints had proven so effective that it had been expanded to address other passenger service issues. And the surveillance system, now present in both premium and economy cabins, served as both deterrent and documentation, ensuring that future incidents couldn't be dismissed as mere misunderstandings. As the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, Marcus opened his tablet to review the quarterly performance reports. Elite Airways premium bookings had increased, despite industry analysts' predictions that the publicized incident would damage the brand. The transparency with which the company had addressed the discrimination and committed to reform had resonated with travelers tired of corporate apologies without meaningful change. Captain Lisa Hernandez's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 347 to San Francisco. 6 months ago, Marcus had boarded an aircraft where he was seen as an intruder in a space not meant for people who looked like him. Today, he flew on an airline transformed, not perfect, but actively striving to create an environment where dignity and respect were extended to every passenger regardless of appearance. The note from the crew rustled in his pocket as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. The incident had never been about a meal or a flight diversion, or even one crew's prejudice. It had been about the simple yet profound principle that spaces designed for all must truly welcome all, and the recognition that meaningful change required not just addressing individual incidents, but transforming the systems that allowed them to occur. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to feel something that had eluded him on too many previous journeys. The simple pleasure of being treated not as an exception or an intruder, but simply as a passenger, welcomed aboard without qualification or condition. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.